Welcome to What Can a Cartoon Tell Us? Let's take a closer look at this example of a cartoon in the National Archives collection. Our cartoon was created for the Ministry of Information in 1944 by Reginald Mount, a British cartoonist. Its catalogue reference is INF 31321. Let's go through some useful questions to help us understand it. What type of source is this? We can see that it is a colour cartoon with a caption. Not all cartoons have one. This one says, "You can rely on my judgment. Remember, I was once a soldier of the Reich. So were we." Who produced it? The reference INF for the cartoon means that it comes from records created by the Ministry of Information. We know it was created in 1944 during the Second World War. The Ministry of Information was the government department responsible for publicity and propaganda at that time. Why was it produced? The cartoon was a form of propaganda used to convince the British public and possibly those fighting against the Allies that Hitler's war plans were a total failure. Its purpose was to convince the British and their allies of victory and the need to keep up support for the war. It is in colour, so unlikely to be produced for a newspaper, probably intended for a poster which could have been displayed in public spaces. What can we infer from this cartoon? Let's take a closer look at the different elements of the cartoon to see what we can find out. The image shows Hitler standing on a pile of plans between two heaps of dead soldiers with skulls, one pile labelled Stalingrad and the other Tunisia. Adolf Hitler is instantly recognisable by his toothbrush moustache. His facial expression suggests he is afraid and exhausted. His body is small and he looks weak. His boots are worn out to reveal his toes to suggest his armies are running out of supplies and equipment. There's a broken telescope to imply that he can't see what is really happening. He is holding several rolled up plans to suggest he is indecisive or panicking. There's even a book called How to Read the Stars, a humorous reference to the fact that Hitler consulted astrologers. Indeed, documents at the National Archives show that British spies hired an astrologer during the Second World War to write horoscopes for him and other Nazi leaders. The abandoned paint pot is perhaps a reference to his very early career as a failed artist. The artist has composed the cartoon in this way to capture Hitler's arrogance and overconfidence, his hubris or pride before a fall. Hitler's foreign policy for German expansion and domination are suggested to be a total failure because he's standing on a heap of abandoned plans, maps or initiatives. Can you see one plan is labelled Master Plan 2057761 and another one, Great Plan number 43? This is probably to suggest it is one of a long series of failures. The caption for the cartoon also suggests that Hitler's claim that the German military forces can rely on him, as he was an experienced soldier who saw service and earned the Iron Cross in the First World War, is totally misplaced. This is because the caption appears in the form of a conversation. The response to Hitler's comment is, "So were we." This is shown in a ghostly speech bubble as the voices of the German soldiers who died on the battlefields of Stalingrad and Tunisia. This illustrates how the cartoon uses irony to express its message. How does the cartoon relate to a historical situation? The cartoon references two different theatres of war, Stalingrad on the Eastern Front and Tunisia as part of the North African campaign. It is important, therefore, that we have some contextual knowledge of these events to help us unlock the message of the cartoon. The pile of dead German soldiers and skulls is explained as follows. The Battle of Stalingrad proved to be the turning point in the Second World War. Germany had been forced to remove military forces from other areas in occupied Europe to replace German losses on the Eastern Front. In the run-up to this conflict in the spring of 1942, Hitler had ordered his forces to advance towards the USSR's oil fields in the Caucasus region. The Soviets resisted fiercely, suffering huge civilian and military casualties, and by September, the Germans had reached the outskirts of the city of Stalingrad on the river Volga. German forces fought their way, building by building, towards this river, which divides the city. They reached it in November 1942, but at a heavy cost of over 700,000 casualties. The German army was left without supplies or reinforcements. As winter set in, the Soviets began to drive them back. From November 1942 to February 1943, the Germans were worn down and encircled. German forces at Stalingrad surrendered at the beginning of February 1943 after one of the bloodiest battles in human history had resulted in almost 2 million casualties. Through the rest of 1943, the Red Army gradually regained territory from the German invaders. Now, let's look at Tunisia, which along with Morocco and Algeria was for the most of the conflict in the hands of Vichy France. This fascist government made a pact with Nazi Germany in July 1940 after the fall of France. Germany occupied Tunisia from November 1942 to May 1943. Tunisian Jews and Muslims suffered Germany's anti-Semitic and racist laws. The Allies launched Operation Torch to drive out the German Nazis and Italians from French North Africa in November 1942. They formed 3 task forces to seize ports at Casablanca, Oran and Algiers before moving east into Tunisia. After 6 months of fighting, the German Nazi Africa Corps and Italians surrendered to the Allied army in Tunisia in May 1943. The German and Italian forces in North Africa sustained 40,000 casualties in Tunisia alone. 267,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners of war. The invasion of North Africa by the USA and Britain was the precursor of the Allied D-Day invasion of Normandy. Therefore, the dreadful signs written in blood that we see in the cartoon explain the human cost of both Hitler's campaigns. What techniques of persuasion does the cartoon use to give its message? Cartoons as sources must be read to be understood. The artist here uses a range of techniques to express his ideas. For example, our cartoon has a very clear caption, a sentence which gives the cartoon the punchline or message that Hitler, with all his plans, cannot win this war. The cartoon also uses labels to ensure we understand its context, in this case German defeat at Stalingrad and in Tunisia. Let's examine how objects and figures are used in the composition of the cartoon. Hitler is shown in the centre. He's hemmed in and cannot escape the piles of bodies and plans on all sides which represent his defeat as a leader. The cartoon also uses caricature to show Hitler. He is instantly recognisable from his moustache and pointed nose seen in numerous other cartoons. He looks foolish as part of his appearance is exaggerated in this way. There is also evidence of symbolism within the cartoon where an object is used to represent an idea. For example, the globe is cast aside, which suggests plans for world domination have failed. Other techniques not particularly evident in our cartoon are also used by cartoonists. Let's take a look at another example which uses the technique of analogy. Analogy means the comparison in which an idea or thing is compared to another thing and is often used to help explain a principle or idea. This cartoon from Punch magazine in 1911 comments on British and Russian influence in Persia or Iran. Both countries are shown to embody the characteristics of different animals. Russia is a bear and Britain a lion. Persia is represented by a pet cat. At the start of the 20th century, Russia and Britain had competing economic and political interests in Persia. In 1907, they signed an agreement that allowed each country to pursue its interests without competition from the other. Russia had exclusive influence in northern Persia and Britain in southern Persia. The context of this cartoon is that Britain and Russia agreed that a Russian force would go to the city of Tabriz in northwestern Iran in June 1908 in response to a revolutionary siege. The Russians occupied the city from April 1909 until 1911. At that point, the Russian government gave the Persian government an ultimatum, which was refused. The Shah, or Emperor, dissolved parliament and agreed. Further conflict broke out in Tabriz, and Russian troops were attacked. Further troops were sent from Russia to occupy Tabriz and 2 other cities. The revolutionaries of Tabriz were executed, and Russian forces stayed there until 1917. The use of relative size is another cartoonist technique. This means that some figures are drawn larger or smaller than others to make a point or statement. This is shown to great effect in this cartoon from Ditty Box magazine, which was produced by the Navy during the Second World War. Here we can see the US President Franklin Roosevelt in contrast to Hitler the boxer. This juxtaposition works to stress the might and power of the United States and the weakness of Germany under the leadership of Hitler, who is claiming to be a powerful boxer in the image. Now, going back to our example, are there any clues about the audience of the cartoon? The biggest clue for discovering the audience for our cartoon is that we know it was created for the Ministry of Information. Therefore, it was probably intended for a mass audience. As said earlier, it could have been used for public spaces like a factory canteen, town hall, a station or shop. How reliable is our cartoon? Does it have any limitations? Certainly, Hitler's territorial ambitions extended from the reoccupation of the Ruhr in 1936 and after the Munich Agreement over Czechoslovakia in 1938, so reading it as a reflection of Hitler's expansionist policies as a war leader is accurate. The cartoon uses satire to ridicule his failures, which does not detract from its truth. The source is reliable in the sense it references real historical events, the losses experienced by Germany at Stalingrad and Tunisia. Obviously, the cartoon is not naturalistic. Hitler is shown in caricature, and there is much to infer from it as an obvious example of propaganda. It's worth knowing too that cartoons are not covered by the laws of libel. This potentially would raise the question of their reliability. Written defamation or libel is anything published or broadcast to ruin or damage the reputation of a person or a business. Slander is spoken defamation. How does it relate to other sources from this period? Does it share the same attitudes or ideas? Hitler is shown as a similar stereotype figure in many wartime propaganda cartoons. The messaging for national solidarity and support of the war effort is also a constant theme in these cartoons. In terms of different types of sources, there are Foreign Office records which include accounts of people who met Hitler and described his personality, so comparisons could also be made to our cartoon. Other sources, such as war diaries or Air Ministry and Admiralty records, could give more detail on campaigns, offer other perspectives and more detailed historical context. Cabinet papers for the war years would be an excellent point of comparison too. Military maps and intelligence and security service records could be explored for yet more context. The National Archives Research Guide on the Second World War is a very good place to start to find this material.